welcome and thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. It's so nice to. I mean, it's so weird to say it's so nice to be here, but I do feel like when you give these Zoom talks, that you do have this weird sense of teleportation. That I somehow feel like I'm in Estonia briefly, but I wish I was actually really there. Maybe next time. And it's a delight to be invited to give a talk to a group where I feel, I guess, I feel less self-conscious about talking about both my science and my artistic adventures. I've only really done this once before, so normally the audiences I speak to are either people who I talk to about science or people I talk to about art, but very, very rarely both. So thank you for existing as a place that welcomes that kind of nonsense on my part. So I'm going to start out talking about the science. So these are going to be two talks. But what I'd like, ideally, is some help in spotting lines of connection. I really feel like I need some help seeing these two things kind of interdigitate with each other. I've kind of got a sort of personal mission statement to do science and art, and eventually to not know which is which. That's my life goal. So any help you can give me on that would be really, really gratefully received. So I'll talk for don't know how long, 40 minutes or so, probably, on the science, and then I'll take questions on that, and then we'll go on to the arts stuff. And the art talk will be much more showing and less telling. So I'll show you some films of the projects I've been involved with. But I guess my day job, the job that pays most of the bills, is my work at the Centre for Language Evolution here at Edinburgh. And what we do here is try and understand the nature of language by asking how language evolved. That's kind of what we do. And so I thought I'd start in the kind of broadest possible terms by talking about what it is that an evolutionary linguist is particularly interested in. And to me, it's the idea that language does have some properties that, if not unique, are extremely rare elsewhere in nature. And it's those, what we would call design features of language, that an evolutionary linguist will want to try and explain. So Charles Hockett made famous this idea of the design feature, but there are lots and lots of different ways we could carve it up. So I'm going to talk to you about one particular design feature that I think is very important and kind of fundamental to how language works. And on this slide, at the top is a acoustic waveform of me saying 2 boots. And at the bottom is a picture of my son when he was much smaller, wearing his 2 favorite Converse boots. Now, so that's just a mapping between sound and meaning you can think of. But what language does, and as far as we can tell, no other species do, although there are some interesting kind of maybes out there. What language does is make this mapping between sound and meaning in a very particular way, and it involves these 2 layers of representation. So the top layer here, you can see this sound 2 boot is broken up into smaller parts, and these phonemes can be recombined to make other kinds of signals, right? And the important point is their reuse here. There's vowels and consonants here which are reused in different places, but each of those doesn't carry meaning, right? The letter T there isn't carrying any meaning on its own. So there's this meaningless layer of recombination, a combinatorial layer in language. But then there's a second layer where those meaningless parts are combined together to make meaningful wholes, morphemes or words. And that's the bottom layer there in the diagram. And then the meaning of the whole is made out of recombinations of these meaningful parts, and the meaning is composed of the meaning of them. Okay, so we've got these 2 layers, the meaningless combinatorial layer and the meaningful compositional layer in language. And this is what Hockett called duality of patterning. But we can sort of break it down, as I have done here, into two parts: a combinatoriality and a compositionality of language. And for me, a lot of what I do is really shaped by this, right? This is a kind of fundamental, this is a feature of language that I talk about in my first lecture of my first year course in linguistics here in Edinburgh. And basically the rest of the degree doesn't touch on it. It's so basic and so fundamental, and yet most of linguistics isn't really concerned with trying to understand where this comes from. But an evolutionary linguist looks at this and looks at how rare it is elsewhere and says, hang on a minute, what's going on? Why is language like this? And one way of sort of glossing what's going on here is in terms of systematicity. So if you look at most communication in nature, so for example, the alarm calls of some primate species, you can generally think of them as just a bag of independent behaviours. So independent mappings of meanings and signals. So it could be like a vervet monkey call for leopards and the concept of leopard, and they're just paired together. So there's no sense in which these individual signals are related to each other in any particular way. And that's fundamentally different to language. So language is, if it's nothing else, is a system of behaviour. So every utterance you hear in a language relates in some ways to all the other utterances in the language. There are systematic relationships that are being leveraged by a language user to communicate. So languages are systems of behaviour rather than just big bags of independent behaviours. And that's true of language at all levels of description, from the phonetics all the way up to the pragmatics of language. So ultimately, what we want to understand as evolutionary linguists is the origins of this systematicity in language. Where does systematicity come from? And maybe also, why is it so rare? Why don't we see this kind of thing elsewhere in nature? So why does language exhibit this unique kind of system-wide structuring? So that's the topic for the work that we're doing in Edinburgh. And before I get to answering that question, I want to just think about another unusual, absolutely not unique, but unusual feature about language, and that's learning. So there are some, and indeed many, communication systems in nature where there isn't a heavy reliance on learning. So alarm calls, for example, are essentially innate, right? You don't find one group of vervet monkeys using one set of alarm calls and another group of vervet monkeys using a different set of alarm calls. And that's because they're innately specified. But that's obviously not true of language. The language that I'm speaking now is the result of me being exposed to the use of language when I was developing as an infant, say for you guys, or as a process of learning as adults. But the important point is that the specifics of the language we use are acquired through a process of learning, and that's unusual. But what's really striking about this is what it means for the way in which language is transmitted over time. And this is a thing that we've called iterated learning. So the language that I speak is going on to influence the language that my kids speak, and in turn that will influence the language that their kids speak, and so on. So the language that we speak is a product of this long-running remapping of information from an external world of utterances to an internal world of mental representations and back out again. So everything that we do with language has gone through these exceptionally long chains of transmission where the language has been repeatedly mapped in and out over generations. And of course, this is cultural evolution, right? So cultural evolution is this process of transmission through learning over historical time. So we've got these two things that we're saying are unique or nearly unique to language. There's this systematic structure and iterated learning. And so the obvious question is, could these two things be related? And to put it another way, can the process of cultural evolution explain why languages have structure? And obviously I'm posing that question not because I think the answer is no. What I'm going to try and convince you is that absolutely yes, that cultural evolution doesn't just explain how languages change, and I mean I shouldn't say just, that's a really important thing to study, but also the origins of these fundamental design features of language themselves arise too out of this cultural process of transmission through this repeated transformation of language into the external world and back into the internal world and so on over many generations. Okay, so if I'm going to try and mount that claim and convince you of it, you're going to need some evidence. So how do we study this? How can we test whether that cultural evolution can explain why languages have structure? And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to give 3 examples of one of the 2 main methods that we use for tackling this question. So the 2 methods we typically use are, well, they both involve trying to recreate the process of cultural evolution in a way that we can study it. So in a way, building a miniature model of the cultural evolution of language and cultural evolution generally. And so we either do that using computational simulations, agent-based simulations, or we do that in the lab setting with real human participants, and not just human participants, as you'll see. So for this talk, I've decided to concentrate on the lab, but a lot of these experiments also have analogous computational models to sit with them, and I think in some ways that's the best approach to this problem, is to try and do both together. Okay, so so the 3 experiments I'm going to talk about. First experiment I'm going to show is kind of the minimal experiment of cultural evolution, and I'm going to show that cultural evolution leads to compressible drawings. The second experiment will take that into the domain of language and look at artificial sign language evolution. And in the third experiment, I will take things in a different direction entirely and show that actually, surprisingly, we can recreate the same kind of things in a non-human primate, which raises some problematic questions about why language is uniquely human, which I'll hope to answer. Okay, so that's the roadmap for this first talk. Okay, so the first experiment. So this is a kind of warm-up, really. This is arguably the simplest possible cultural evolution experiment. It's been done many times. In fact, it was first done around 100 years ago, I think. But it has been done several times since then. So this is joint work with Monica Tamariz, and what we wanted to do was to redo this very simple experiment with a bit of a twist, and also try out some new types of quantitative analysis on the results. And so this isn't language, but it inspires some of the ideas that go into the linguistics experiments too. And this is an experiment. If I was giving this talk in person, we'd actually do it with the audience, but never mind. You'll just have to look at the results. So the idea is you give people a completely nonsensical doodle like this kind of squiggle drawing, and we give it them on a piece of paper, and then we ask people to copy it onto another piece of paper with a pen that we provide. And then the second person in this chain of transmission takes the first person's drawing and tries to copy that, and then the third person copies from the second, and so on, right? So we have this transmission chain where a drawing gets passed down through many generations of participants in the experiment. So this is basically like a graphical version of the game of broken telephone. Now, the twist that we did, we've got two conditions in this experiment. So in one condition, participants are shown the drawing, and then the drawing remains visible, and they try and copy it onto another piece of paper. So that's the copy condition. And then in the other condition, which we call the memory condition, they're shown the drawing, and then it's put down again, and then immediately they have to draw it. So there's very, very little difference. The whole experiment takes about, I'm not sure actually, about 15 seconds or something. So there's very little difference between these two conditions. It's just like you're shown and it's held up versus you're shown and it's put down. And what we're going to do is see what the difference is in the way in which these drawings evolve as they get passed down in these two conditions. And I'm just going to show you an example, okay? So, so this is the initial drawing and I'm going to show you the copy condition. And so we're just going to step through how that drawing changes in one of these chains of transmission. Okay. So this is the copy condition, and you can see errors in copying creep in, and they accumulate over time until we end up with something that looks really quite unlike the original drawing. That's the final drawing. So, and you can see that evolution is quite smooth. It feels continuous in a way, and it's just small copying errors. But the point here is that these small copying errors can accumulate and lead to quite diverse outcomes. And in fact, if we do this 4 times, these are the final drawings on 4 different chains in the copy condition, all starting from the same seed, right? All starting from the same drawing. And you can see that they're all really diverse. Okay, so that's just an example of how divergence can happen in cultural transmission with copying error. But let's have a look at what happens with the memory condition. And recall, this is exactly the same, it's just the drawing is put down before they copy it. Same starting condition, and we'll step through. Okay, so a few things you might have noticed there. So this drawing has got a lot simpler. And actually that simplicity has led in the end to some pretty accurate copying, right? Towards the end there, the differences seem to have basically settled because it's much easier to copy. And in fact, if we look again, the bottom half of this graph, this slide shows 4 different runs of that experiment with the memory condition. So the copy condition drawings look more elaborate than the memory condition drawings, but there's also the memory condition drawings, like 3 of them have no recognizable letters or numbers in them. And the other one that I showed you, you might recognize it as something else, neither a letter or a number. But the main thing I want to get across here is how much simpler these look. Now it turns out this is kind of what we expected, but what I didn't expect is an obvious way to leap out of this experiment of how to actually measure this. And I was looking at the file. We scanned these in a normal scanner, and I had all the files on my computer, and I happened to have it open with the view where you can see the file sizes of these just standard JPEG scans. And it was striking that the file sizes for the scans in the memory condition were all smaller than the file sizes for the scans in the copy condition. And it made me realize that we can actually use standard measures of compression from computer science to measure what's happening in these cultural evolution experiments. And in fact, this is what it looks like. So the darker line here is the copy condition, and this is a particular compression algorithm that tries to compress these drawings as much as it can. So it vectorizes the drawings, and then it gzips the vector representation of the drawings. And So in the copy condition, there's divergence, so the variance increases in this graph, the error bars get bigger, but basically it's flat. But in the memory condition, we get this marked drop in file size of these drawings after they've been through a scanner. So, and it's cumulative, right? So what seems to be happening here is something about cultural evolution when the behavior being copied is passed through memory leads to more compressible behaviors. So this made us suggest that cultural evolution in general leads to compressible behaviors when it involves iterated learning. So then the question is, could we use this idea of an increase in compressibility to explain where structure comes from in language? And so I'm going to go through the second experiment where we take these methods and extend them to something more language-like. And so this was we wanted to ask whether we could recreate language evolution in the lab, and this is mainly the work of my postdoc Yasmin Motamedi. And this work was inspired by emerging sign languages. So emerging sign languages, these are really new, young languages that emerge in parts of the world where a lot of previously isolated deaf individuals are brought together. So this is an example of, in the video there, of signers of Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is a very young sign language that emerged spontaneously in a very rapid timescale as deaf individuals are brought together in the school context. And what's interesting about it is that structure in these languages emerges very rapidly, but it's not instantaneous. So there is a process that we can observe by looking at different ages of signers that represent different time periods in the evolution of the sign language. We can look at where structure is coming from. The other thing that's really interesting, and I don't really have time to go into it in much detail, is that the process of emergence seems to depend a bit on the social structure of the group. So there are some emerging sign languages where some structure has yet to emerge or is emerged in a different way, and then other emerging sign languages where the structure has emerged very rapidly. And it turns out what we think is going on, there is an importance in these contexts of interaction within the community of signers and transmission to new learners. So both of those two things seem to be important in creating a language. So what Yasmin set out to do is investigate these two things: interaction within a community, interaction between individuals, and transmission to new learners in a lab context. So we're essentially trying to recreate this emergence of a sign language in the experiment lab in Edinburgh. And the setup of the experiment is quite simple. That's not to say it's not a difficult experiment to run. It's kind of quite elaborate. But basically we have this setup where we have chains of individuals, just like we had with the drawing experiment. But now instead of one individual per generation, we've got two, because we need people to be interacting. So in the main stage of the experiment, we have pairs of participants in these transmission chains interacting. So there's 5 generations in each chain, and there are 5 chains in the experiment. So these form these 5 different generations. And what each pair of participants do when they get into the lab, they go into separate booths and they watch live streaming video, so they can see what the other person in the other booth is doing. First off, they're trained on the gestures used by the previous generation. So these recordings are purely video and no sound. And then in testing, the participants communicate with each other just using gesture over the video link. So the gestures from one of those pair of participants is used to train the next generation in the study. Okay, so we've got this idea that this non-spoken manual language can get transmitted from pairs of interacting participants where the next participants see what the previous pair did. And to start the experiment off, we start with what we call seed gestures. So we just get individuals into the lab and they see a particular concept they're going to have to convey, and they're asked to gesture for it. And this is used as the kind of input language for the study over time. And we can call that generation 0 in the experiment. So this is all a bit abstract, so I'm going to now tell you what they actually were communicating about. So this is kind of like a game of charades, right? In fact, all of my experiments are essentially games, it turns out, which is it's a fun way to spend it, to make a living. Okay, so these are the concepts that participants had to convey in this experiment. So they are arranged in this table for a reason, because there's consistencies in the way in which they're laid out. So you've got a concept like chef, and that's a person who's to do with food, okay? And then you've got a concept like singer, also a person, but now to do with music. So chef and singer share this feature that they're both people, right? Chef and frying pan share this feature that they're to do with food, but one's a person and one's an object. So we've got these kind of two cross-cutting dimensions to the way the meanings are laid out. So some of the meanings are more similar to each other than others because they share one of these dimensions. So chef and camera don't share anything in common, right? So one is person and food, and the other one's object, photography. Okay, so we just constructed this set of meanings for people to gesture about. We want it to have this kind of inherent structure to it, to see if what happened is that people in this experiment leveraged this structure and leveraged it in a way that looks like this compositionality that I talked about in the first slide. So do we get gestures where these different dimensions end up being expressed with different parts of gesture, which would be the equivalent to that kind of compositional mapping? Okay, so this is an example. So this is one of the seed videos. So remember, this is someone we just got in and we just said, we're going to ask you to make a gesture to make an arrest. And that's all they were asked to do. And then they left. Okay, so this is what she did. Okay, I'm going to check with you that you can see that video okay. Is it smooth enough that you can see what she's doing?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great, thank you. It's always a bit unsure with Zoom. All right, so you could see, I'll show that again. So she's gesturing a gun and then running and then catching someone and then putting handcuffs on them and handcuffing them. Okay, so that's to make an arrest. That's the sort of typical thing, this very pantomimic gesture. Here's one for, again, another seed video. This one's for church. I like this one. So he opens the door, he looks in awe, he prays, crosses himself, prays. So it's like this idea, he's embodying this process of walking into a church and being overcome by the religiosity of it. So these are kind of typical. So we've got a whole batch of these for all of the concepts. And then the main stage of the experiment, we take these, do all of them, and transmit them to the next generation. So the generation sees a bunch of these videos, and then they don't actually see all of them. They see there's some withheld items, and those are different each generation. But the first generation, the two participants see these videos first, and then they try and communicate. And the way the communication works is one of them is told, okay, now you've got to signal church, and the other person watches the gesture and has to click from that array which meaning they think was being conveyed. Okay, so just a reminder, there's church at the top, the seed video, and we're going to watch what happens after one generation. So here's one of the participants. Okay, and the other participant a bit more shy. Okay, that was her gesture for church. And as I say, one of these two would have been chosen to be in the training data for the next participant, and so on. And I'm going to skip forward to generation 5 in this experiment. So look, let's see what this has turned into in 5th generation. A box, and then a line across the throat. For those of you who don't know, so this line across the throat is a dog collar. So that's a part of religious dress. So there's a square and then a dog collar. And the other guy, square, dog collar. Okay. So it's very much obvious that there's two parts here. This big elaborate pantomime is crispened up into these two things, this square and the line. So that gives you a sense that there's something going on here. There's some kind of systematicity might be emerging, but it becomes really obvious when we look at a whole strip of videos down an array of meanings. Now these are really small, so you might want to peer at your screens for this. Sorry, they're so small, but hopefully you'll be able to see anyway what's going on. So this is just the person category across all of the different kind of functional dimensions. So chef, vicar, photographer, and so on. And this is the first generation. Right, so watch this, loads and loads of different kind of strategies going on here. It'll loop. So you see there's all sorts of things going on, how she's gesturing these different people. Lots of kind of acting out behaviours, lots of different strategies. But now let's look, same meanings, same chain, but at the 5th generation. Okay, all but one of these start with point itself and then some other gesture. And what I find really startling here is the timing is incredibly precise, even across these different. And we haven't actually measured that. I should really measure it, but it's remarkable how synchronized these are across different recordings of this one participant. So we have a point itself and another thing. Now this is clearly compositional, right? There's these different parts that are conveying different meanings, and they're quite separated. So the point itself, apart from one of them, is all identical. So what seems to have happened, oh, and the other thing I should say, of course, they're much shorter. These videos are much shorter. So what seems to have happened in this experiment is gone from something pantomimic, so unsystematic, imagistic, elaborate, redundant, and turned it into something much more, what I would argue is language-like, in that it is both systematic and efficient. And we can actually put some numbers on that. So Yasmin went in and categorized these gestures for whether they had something called, which she called a category marker. So these were markers that were meaningful to a whole category and not just an individual item. And so there'd be person, location, object, and action. And she found, for example, here we've got one where person's point itself, location's that drawing of a square, object is point at the object, and action, weirdly, in this case, is just a hand like this. Okay, we can talk about that in questions if you want. And what we were able to do is just count how many times those category markers appear. And so we've got generations on one axis and the proportion of functional markers for the 4 different types. And you can see here this lovely cumulative increase of functional markers over generations. And what's also interesting is that they don't typically emerge for the verbs, for the actions. So this is, the participants are discovering or introducing a category difference between nouns and verbs here in their use of markers. But crucially, this cumulative increase of these markers that support compositional encoding. Also, we can measure efficiency. So there's 2 different ways we've used here. One is the length in seconds of the gestures, and the other one is the number of repetitions. These graphs are a bit messy, but they both show a statistically significant decline over generations. Okay, so to summarize where we've got to. So we get these systematic, efficient languages in this experiment. And in this experiment, we've got both transmission to new individuals and interaction between pairs. So these two processes are at play. So interaction and transmission together lead to the emergence of these language-like structures from pantomime. But we wanted to know exactly what does each mechanism contribute. So we wanted to look at running the experiment again with just transmission and running the experiment again with just interaction. And so that's what we did. So we can isolate these two in this design quite easily. So that's the original design where we've got interacting individuals transmitting from generation to generation. Transmission-only experiment is very simple. You just have one individual per generation and there's no interaction. Okay, so this is very simple. This is more like the drawing experiment in a way. And then the interaction-only experiment is exactly like the first one, but we just don't replace the participants. We just keep them in the lab for a long time and they just keep interacting with each other. So here we've got the two processes, the transmission to new brains, if you like, and the interaction between people. And our claim is that these two do very different things to the process of shaping a language. Okay, so just a little reminder, this is what transmission and interaction did. It created these category markers plus the other marker, so this compositional two-part signals emerged. So let's look at what happened with transmission only. So this is just transmitting, no interaction. Okay, so for prison, handcuffing, some bars, it's in a building, there's someone behind the bars, it's in a building, there's some bars again, and then behind the bars. So this is at the end, this is the 5th generation, right? It's really long, really redundant, lots and lots of repetition. Here's church. So in a building, they're crossing themselves, they're handing out books, crossing themselves, they're in a building, and done. So you can see they're parts, but they're kind of just stuffed together and with lots and lots of repetition. So that's transmission, what transmission does. Let's look at interaction. Okay, these are short. So here's prison. That's it. And here's church. That's it. So now we don't have obvious parts and they're incredibly efficient. And I should point out in these cases, they're basically everyone's at ceiling with guessing, right? Everyone can solve this task really, really well. Okay, so what we see here is that without transmission, we get some increase in category markers. So this is the original one with transmission plus interaction. This is transmission only. So in transmission only, you also get this cumulative increase in these category markers. But notice it was like really long and elaborate. Whereas when there's just interaction, you get a little increase in the 1st generation, which you'd expect because that's identical across across the two conditions. But then it just sticks. It doesn't cumulatively increase. So without new learners, you don't get the accumulation of this structuring process. It just grinds into the ground and stops. So you get category marking when there's transmission, basically, but not when there's only interaction. On the other hand, interaction, it seems to be what's driving the increase in efficiency. So transmission without interaction leads to increased redundancy. So this is the graph I showed you already. This is the number of repetitions in the transmission plus interaction condition. You can see it goes down over time. This is with interaction only. It goes down very convincingly. The interaction only condition is very efficient. But this is with transmission only, and I have to point out the different scale here. So in the first two graphs, the scale goes from 0 to 1.2, and this goes from 0 to 6. So without interaction, the gestures get longer and longer and longer and longer every generation. Okay, so just to summarize where we've got to, interaction leads to efficiency and transmission leads to systematicity. And it's only when both are in play do we get something that's language-like. So iterated learning leads to these compressible systems, and when these systems are also used for communication, language-like properties emerge. So I'm going to finish this first talk with the last experiment, which I'll go through quite quickly, which really asks the question of whether this process of systematization is uniquely human. And this is joint work with Nicolas Cladière, Joël Fagot, and Kenny Smith. And we got the opportunity to do this work because of this lab in Marseille. This is a lab where there are some baboons. They're reared in captivity, but they are given this free roam in this enclosure. And inside the enclosure, there are these experiment booths that the baboons are free to go into if they want. So like on sunny days, they don't go into them very much, but other days they go into them more. And inside the booths, there are these touch screens, and the baboons can reach through to use the touch screen. And what's clever about it is that the baboons have a microchip in their arm, which means that when they reach through, the experiment software knows what animal that is, and they're able to run an experiment that's tailored to that animal. And there's a food dispenser, a robotic food dispenser that handles the reward schedule. So what this means is you can mount an experiment that runs in this population of baboons without any human interaction at all. And in fact, none of the experimenters interact with the baboons. The only humans they interact with are the vets, basically, when needed. So it's a very interesting setup, and it also it allows you to run very large experiments of like tens of thousands of trials, which would be impossible to do in any reasonable time in another setup. So we realized that we could use this setup to run iterated learning experiments in baboons. And so we hit on this design. So this is a visual memory design. So in some ways, this is somewhat similar to the drawing experiment, but very idealized. So what the baboons do is they see this pattern of squares, and some of them, 4 of them, are lit up in red, and after the red squares disappear, the baboon just has to touch the squares that were red, and if they get 3 or 4 of those correct, they get a food reward, and then they can just do the next trial and so on. Right? And they're pretty good at this, right? They're very good at this, in fact, but they do make mistakes. So what we did was we took this design and we realized that we could treat this like an iterated learning experiment. So we would give the first baboon 50 random grid patterns, which they would then try and repeat, obviously, immediately copy. And whether or not they got them right, those were the 50 grid patterns that were given to the second baboon to copy. And then the 50 grid patterns that the second baboon produced were given to the third baboon, and so on. Now, the important point to note here, is really important, is that we're transmitting not just single patterns now, but whole sets. We're transmitting a set of 50 patterns, but each one is immediately copied. They're not having to try and remember the patterns. In fact, it's presented as an immediate copying task. They get reward then and there, move on, next trial. They're not presented as in some way as being related. Okay, so what happens to the patterns over time? Well, firstly, the task gets easier over generations, and we know that. But that's the blue line here. That's the probability of success over generations in this experiment. The orange line looks like it's trending downwards, but it's not. It's flat, statistically speaking. And the orange line is 50 matched random trials that we gave each baboon before they did the transmission trials. So we had a baseline in which to compare them. So the task is getting easier over time, but notice it's not getting easier because the baboons are learning, right? They're not getting better at the random trials. And the way the design is worked, it's not like they've got more experience. No, so something about the patterns is changing to make it easier. So let's see what that is. So this is a visualization of 50 in one of the chains of the experiment, the 50 random grid patterns at generation 0 that the first animal was given. And you've noticed I've colored some of them. They weren't colored in the experiment, but I've colored them for a reason that you'll see as we step forward. Okay, so this is generation 0, and this is what they changed into after one generation. So lots of errors, and the first baboon has changed the patterns somewhat. And now I'm just going to step through the rest. So generation 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so that's after 12 generations, that's what those grid patterns have turned into. Now, if you look at these patterns, some of you will recognize them, I think. So some of you, if you're mathematically inclined, will think, they're the Tetrominos. But most of you will probably think, they're the Tetris pieces. And it's definitely an understatement to say that we weren't expecting our French baboons to invent Tetris. But that seems to be what's happened here, right? They're not Russian. So this was like, I mean, people say, I was surprised by my results. We were really surprised by these results. So, like, this is the expected result if there was no bias in favor of Tetrominos, right? This is the proportion of random grid patterns that fall into one of the different Tetris shapes, which are the different colors at the bottom of that graph. And this is what actually happened. So we have this enormous increase in the number of Tetrominos. Now, you'd look at that and think, okay, there's something about Tetromino shapes that is easier for the baboons to copy, right? That seems like the obvious explanation. And you can think of ones, right? They're like closer together in the visual field, maybe, or maybe the arm doesn't have to move as far. And it turns out that's not what's going on, because then this is the weirdest result. We could check how easy it is for a baboon to copy a Tetromino, because we've got these random trials. So we can look in these 50 random trials and say, were they more successful with the non-Tetromino shapes or the Tetromino shapes? And it turns out they find the Tetromino shapes harder to copy in the random trials, but that turns around in the transmission trials. In the transmission trials, they copy them better. And what the explanation for this is that the Tetrominos individually might be harder to copy, but as a group, as a set, as a system, they're easier. So what's emerged here in this animal is a systematic set of culturally transmitted behaviours that is more stable through cultural transmission because it works as a system rather than as just individual behaviours. So we've got this cumulative cultural evolution of systematic behaviour in the baboon, which is not seen in the wild. And arguably, it's pretty unusual to see systematic structure and culturally transmitted behaviour anywhere other than humans. So what's going on? Why are baboons doing this and not other species? And the answer, I think, lies here in this bit of the apparatus. So this is the robotic food dispenser in the Fagot-Cladier lab. And what this does is it gives an incredibly reliable reward for copying, because we designed the code to do that, right? These baboons will get a reward if they copy. If they don't copy, they won't get a reward. And that, if you think about it, that kind of incredibly reliable reward system, that's not typical for nature. Like, if you copy something reliably, irrespective of what its function is, that isn't typically going to give you an instant food reward. But for some reason, humans don't need this robotic food dispenser in order to transmit behavior culturally. We do it all the time. We'll copy the latest fashion. We'll want to be like our conspecifics. We'll want to do the things our conspecifics do. So what I want to argue is that what is enabled systematic structure in behavior isn't some cognitive hardwiring for systematicity. Rather, it's a reward system for copying. And once you've got that reward system for imitating and copying behavior, sets of behaviors, then this systematicity comes for free. So there's something about humans that we have evolved an endogenous reward system for imitation. And it'd be another talk to say why I think that's happened. But I think that's the difference. And that's why we have the complex cultural behaviors that we do. Okay, just to conclude, and now I'll take some questions before we can talk about art. So I've said that iterated learning leads to compressible or systematic behaviors. And when these behaviors are also used for communication, which is what we saw in the artificial sign language experiment, language-like systems emerge over time. And we can see similar processes in other animals, but we need to provide a scaffold for them, a scaffold that rewards very precise imitation, very precise copying of behavior. Once we do that, even an animal that doesn't show like systematicity of cultural behaviors in the wild will show it in the lab. So human uniqueness lies not in some special module for structure, not a special cognitive bias for structure in language or indeed anything else. But I would argue a very peculiar proclivity for cultural transmission. We want to copy. We are informationally promiscuous as a species. And so that leads to the kind of questions that I started to want to address in my art, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And that's like, what happens when a smart primate emerges that wants to share and copy information for its own sake? And I've sketched these out, and I think of these as, to be honest with you, I think this is the chronological order. You get music and dance, you get language, ultimately later on you get writing, and then you get the internet, and more recently you get things like social media. And we'll start talking about those other murkier topics in a minute. But for now, just thank my collaborators on this sciencey part of what I do, and welcome questions.
Thank you very much. This is amazing. I just opened the questions to the audience. I have questions, but so everybody who wants to speak, either raise your hand after applauding, which many people do. I forgot. So yes, this was great. So please put your either your name in the chat or basically just raise your hand. If nobody wants to go first, I can also go first. Okay, so thank you very much. This was, I mean, there's plenty of things I'm like super fascinated about. And now there is Mark Metz. Let's have him first. Mark.
Thank you. That was fascinating indeed. And so I was thinking about asking the question that might be like really related to what CUDAN is doing, and it might be the connection that on the more methodological level, that to what extent have these their findings, they have been like replicated on this real world data, and I mean like real world data, like large databases like social media writings and digitized books, or even Instagram images, because it's not only limited to like natural language, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so that on one level, work, for example, by people like Andres is essentially taking some of these processes we're talking about and using them to help understand historical corpora. But I would, and other work I would definitely recommend is looking at some of the work on cultural evolution of paintings and so on that work by people like Olivier Morin has done, which I think is really fantastic. But I think more narrowly about the topic that I was focusing on, which is this systematicity. I'd love to see if there is a way of getting at that. Firstly, let's think about non-linguistic domains. This is something I've talked about with Helena Mitton and Olivia Moran. So they do work on alphabets, and they look at properties of individual that are measured essentially on individual letters and alphabets, and try and see if there are consistent trends in history about how alphabets change. And indeed there are. But I'd really like to do is look at systematicity, and my hunch is if there was a way of measuring it properly, that we would expect to see systematicity emerging in alphabets over time. So, and that would mean like this combinatorial reuse of sub-elements in naturally evolving alphabets emerging slowly. So that's one thing I'm hoping to look at and planning to look at. The other non-linguistic domain, which I have not done any work in, and it frustrates me that I haven't, because I feel like there's work to be done in looking at legal systems. So in the history of legal systems. So legal systems seem to show similar properties of becoming more systematic over time. So the history of for example, punishments, initially, historically, they seem to be for individual crimes. Like if you steal a loaf of bread from your next door neighbor, this is the punishment. If you steal it from someone 2 doors down, this is the punishment. Or, I mean, it's a caricature. And then they get replaced by generalizations that apply across a bunch of different crimes. And ultimately, those generalizations enable the formation of more generalizations. And eventually, at the end of like a long period, you've got the ability to form transnational legal frameworks and so on. And I think that's a very similar process of system formation that is driven by the need to compress big sets of behaviors for transmission to the next generation. I'm arguing it's also happening with language. Turning to language specifically, the area that I'm most interested in is cases where we can see this emergence of structuring happening in these emerging sign languages. And there we are wanting to try and measure certain things that we can see across generations in sign languages. So we've sent, so my PhD student, Ash Sato, went to Nicaragua with motion capture cameras to try and measure the properties of different signers in Nicaraguan Sign Language and try to correlate with their age to see if the language was changing like in a quantitative sense over generations. But if anyone has any ideas specifically about this systematicity, because that's the thing I think is quite important and quite hard to capture in other cultural data sets, I'd be very keen to hear about it. Thanks for the question.
Okay, here's Mike Thompson.
Yeah. Well, it was amazing. It was like, there's this sort of talks when you see your jaw gradually dropping further and further.
Thank you.
Actually, one question for the to understand better, well, this your explanation of the baboon experiment. Am I right to understand that your statement is these Tetris figures are more difficult for them, but as soon as they recognize that the task is is essentially concentrated on this subset of possible configurations, it becomes easier because there's fewer of them. It is just 4 or 5 different shapes. Okay.
Yeah, I think.
If that is, then here's the question. If that is true, then they will need some number of first experiments to recognize what sort of the problem they're facing. Yes, so if you show them 50, then they will need like first 3 or 4 or 5 to understand that it is Tetris shapes all the time. So they probably should recognize the first ones, the result on the first ones should be worse, and it should increase as the experiment goes on. Is it happening or not?
Okay, so yes, I think that is a good characterization of what's happening. I suspect that what they're doing is what's special about the Tetris pieces is they are recognizable even if they're translated across space in the grid. And what we actually see in different runs of the experiment is we see different kind of cultures. So you might have a very kind of liney culture where there's lots of lines, or we might have a very kind of skew culture where a lot of the skew pieces appear. But there's something about them that they are recognizable wherever they appear, and that boosts learning when they appear with their fellow shapes. You're right. It should be possible. It would, if that's true, it takes at least one previous exposure to have that advantage. So one thing I should point out is that we randomize the order of the 50 grid patterns between each generation. So we wouldn't be able to do the analysis straightforwardly on like the first ones would be less Tetrisy than the last ones. But we could go in again and look at success by trial, and you would predict that would change. It was a while ago, and I'm not sure whether we did that or not. I think we did, but I should go and check. That's a really very astute observation. I mean, it's interesting to me that it's the Tetris shapes. So there's these mathematically quite well-defined shapes, which essentially don't have gaps in them.
And essentially all the connected shapes of 4 pieces.
Exactly. So they are the shapes that exist as wholes. So there's something interesting about that. It's like,
the latest animals, so to speak.
I have a like, so for me this was equally mind-blowing, and it's interesting that there is so many things I haven't known, even though my PhD is sort of in a similar direction. I worked on sort of Renaissance drawings all the way up to the present, depicting particular Roman ruins, which are so complicated that they're hard to copy. So the idea was to spot these errors as they're transmitted. And so one of the interesting things there's a similar, like basically the equivalent of pantomimic would be geometrical congruence to the ruin, where you just like sort of like basically copy a drawing into another drawing, which is impossible if you do a description, right? So there has been psychological research about that too. While over time, you have sort of a tendency towards what, you know, in cognitive science called figural goodness, old school Gestalt psychology would call it like pregnance, right? So there's like particular patterns that are like these Tetrominos, which is like a hemicycle signifying a barrel vault, while an X is a cross vault and stuff like that. And so basically once that is there, or a particular line width depicts a wall, while the other line width would be a window and stuff like that. And so that is things which seem to emerge in exactly that same way, where there's no writing about it, like people use it, and then, you know, sort of, you can see a couple of generations down, they forget it again, and like when they see a hemicycle, they think it's a niche and not a vault and stuff like that. So there's like really very, very interesting similar patterns going on. But what I'm sort of after, and I think this is actually all the machine learning with images thing, you know, the conspiracy that Max has with himself in the background on this is exactly going after these kind of questions. There is some other thing which is not captured by language, and it's actually sort of ironical in your last diagonal sort of enumeration of things that humans evolved. Images were not in there, like drawings were not in your list. And the question is obviously, do they precede music or not? Like, you know, there's that I think is a really interesting question. And there is a thing which in biology you find this, which I once did a course at university called Form as Meaning, where indeed you know where sort of like what you separate is actually not separate. And in biology, it's a very clear case for this. It's protein folding, right? Where the actual form of the protein is the function. And so in a similar way, in culture, one may argue, and obviously, you know, I don't have proof for that, but like my hunch would be that there is stuff that is language-like and there's stuff that is more protein-like, and images sort of like, just because there is geometrical congruence to ourselves watching the mirror. There's people standing in front of a Caravaggio and starting to cry. There's like no explanation necessary. And that's where you have this kind of form is at the same time the meaning. And so I would be really interested how these two sort of like areas are combined. And maybe there is like, it's a little like a biology of genes and proteins. And here we have sort of language-like sequences. And then there is this sort of, I don't know how I don't have a better term than image, which is wrong because it can be more complicated network structures or something like that, right? Even I think interaction motives in social media or something like that could be like that. And so, yeah, this is not a question, but I just want to point out that there is plenty of stuff where we could probably spend days talking with like the whole group. I think there's different aspects of this, like sort of like emerging in the mind of everybody, I guess.
I think that's a wonderful observation. It immediately makes me think of iconicity in language. So, and that's part of a broader idea of naturalness, right? So we can have if you could sort of set an opposition between naturalness and arbitrariness, right? And I think one of the things that we're learning about language, and it's become a really big theme in linguistics recently, is how much iconicity there is in language that we weren't really paying enough attention to. So we're kind of used to thinking about iconicity in signed languages, where we can sort of see this motivatedness, this naturalness of certain lexical signs and sign language. But it turns out there's tons and tons of it in spoken language as well. So there are all these experiments where you can give people words in a language that they've never heard and is unrelated to any language that they speak, and yet they're able to guess better than chance what the words mean. So there is a lot of this naturalness in even the parts of language that we used to think were arbitrary. So a lot of our work at the moment is looking at this interesting kind of interplay between arbitrariness and naturalness, and some of the graphical communication experiments, which are basically like the game Pictionary, where people just draw 4 particular concepts and other people have to guess them. We can see this kind of climb between very natural, very iconic, very representational drawings into things that look much more schematic and apparently arbitrary. But I think it plays really interestingly with systematicity, because the world is systematic. So if you were producing completely iconic natural representations, in a way your representations would get some systematicity for free. Right, your drawings of buildings that have arched roofs would have arches in them, right? There'd be some compositionality there that just comes from naturalness. So I find this really fascinating to think, what is a learner doing when they're exposed to some kind of system of behavior, and they have expectations of naturalness, but they also have expectations of simplicity and compressibility, and how do all of these things kind of pull and push the linguistic system and indeed cultural systems in general in different directions. So I would love to see that kind of investigation, or at least those kinds of questions being asked about universal prior biases for simplicity in learning versus a preference for naturalness and iconicity, and apply them to drawings and visual art as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is no questions in line, like nobody raised their hand.
So shall we?
I'm
wondering about just in terms of time, whether we should move on to the art.
So I'm holding back my question about how about octopuses, and give you the stage for the next talk.
Okay, great. All right, I'll just going to do a little bit of fiddling about with my computer to get up the next presentation. I've also noticed I'm getting warnings that my internet connection is unstable. So hope this works. Right. Okay. Fiddle, fiddle, fiddle. Right. So what I'm doing with this one is I'm going to share screen in a way that includes the computer audio, because there's a lot. I'm going to show you a lot of. There's going to be some music. So if you've got headphones, this like if you want to listen, if you're somewhere and you want to listen in better quality, put some. Let's see. Right. Yes. And okay. Good. Right. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, can everyone see that? And everyone can hear me, obviously. Okay, so this is where I ended in the last talk. So talked about what happens when a primate emerges in the history of our species that wants to share and copy information for its own sake, what I'm calling informational promiscuity. This is a phrase. There's a phrase that or a word in German that Tecumseh Fitch uses, which is Mitteilungsbedürfnis. And he said this is a kind of description of this unique thing that humans have, which is a kind of oversharing, if you like. And so I've been thinking about a lot of that in my scientific practice. But along the same time, this was maybe, 15 years ago or so, or maybe a bit longer, I started just for fun, collaborating with some artists, sculptors and musicians. And initially it was just something to do of a weekend. But gradually through this process of collaborating with artists, I realized that there would be a different way of investigating these kind of questions about informational promiscuity that weren't scientific. Because I didn't really know how to do science on these later stages of evolution. I didn't feel like I knew enough about it, but I felt like I could take some of my thinking about cultural evolution and human evolution and start asking some questions in using artistic practice and raising those questions in a useful way about these kind of later changes in human behavior. So I'm going to just go through 5 examples of pieces of work that I created. These are all collaborative. I never would have been able to do these on my own. And they're in chronological order. And I'm just going to show you what I did and what my motivations were for creating them. And I'll show you some videos and play you some music, because these are mostly musical installations. And then hopefully you can draw the parallels, or you can see the parallels starting to emerge. So we'll just take them one at a time. So the first one I'm going to talk about back in 2009 was an object called Cyberphone, which we built. And it's really, I'm quite proud of this project, not only because it became quite notorious, but because it's completely insane. In fact, one of the reviews of our first gallery show was this: Cyberphone is, by some distance, the balmiest object ever conceived by anyone anywhere, which I think is my favorite review I've ever had. So what happened was that there was a call for proposals for an arts fund in Scotland from an organisation called New Media Scotland. And they wanted a proposal for a piece of work that was connected to the internet, was about the internet, or was related to the internet in some way. And we saw this proposal and we thought, everyone's going to do some kind of screen-based piece, or they're going to do some kind of interactive website. And we thought, what would be the most stupid way of responding to this brief? And we'll submit that. So what we proposed for this brief, which was successful, thankfully, was the Cyberphone, an autonomous emotional robotic band. And this was the image that we put in the brief. It didn't end up looking anything like this, thankfully. But the idea was we'd been interested in looking at some of the literature on very early musical instruments, things like this one. This is the player piano. So this is from the kind of Victorian era. This is the Sicilian, the perfect piano player, always on top. And a lot of these musical self-playing instruments were presented. They were anthropomorphized. So they were always treated as like, this is your friend, the piano player, or this is a person who plays piano for you and never gets bored, or that kind of thing. So it's this idea that back in the Victorian era, automata were being created. And even though, look, that does not look like a person playing a piano, it looks like a piano with a box on top. Nevertheless, there was this willingness to ascribe and present, in a playful way, obviously, a kind of animacy to these objects. We found that really fascinating, right? That you could have something that looks like a piece of furniture and say, look, this is your friendly piano player. This is a perfect piano player that's always on top. And some of these instruments became quite elaborate. So this is an example of an orchestrion. And so this didn't just play piano, it had drums, it has, what else is in here? Bellows, I think a glockenspiel up there and so on. These are really incredible instruments. And in part of the research for this project, we got to go and see a lot of these and met a totally insane gentleman who lived outside the outskirts of Edinburgh, who repaired these for a hobby. But these are like amazing, beautiful machines that played instruments robotically around the turn of the previous century. And so we got to wondering, what would a 21st century orchestrion look like? What would a 21st century piano player do? Like if you were personifying a musician in the 21st century, what would that be about? And it was around about this time, this was 2009, where there was a lot of interest in a website. Some of you will be too young probably to know what it is. MySpace. And there were bands in the UK certainly who were signed to major record labels just on the back of how many MySpace followers they had. And at the time, this was something that people talked about a lot. It was just like, oh, you just need X thousand MySpace followers. And so what musicians were doing was they were jumping on this very early social media, these social media platforms, and obsessively trying to grow their following. Like there was this kind of sort of desperation about how do you generate more followers. Now that's all super familiar now, right? This is just part of the structure of our world. But at the time it was new and slightly disturbing. And there are all these platforms that were essentially about trying to turn your music and your popularity into a metric that you could just quote and hopefully get money on the back of. So we thought, right, okay, so a 21st century orchestrion needs to be obsessed with its online social media presence, and it needs to just desperately track its online stats. So we decided we'd build one. We'd build an orchestrion that was connected to the internet. It would check its, it would Google itself every 15 seconds. It would look for any metrics of how popular it was, and that would affect its emotional state. And we wanted to design its emotional state to be like addictive and needy and kind of really fucking sad. And it would just be desperately trying to be more and more popular. And the result of this would change the music it would play. Basically, it would play happier music when it was feeling popular, and miserable music when it was sad. So that was our pitch. and we got it, hooray. And then we were like, we now have to figure out how to build this. It's very easy to come up with a pitch like that without actually having any clue. At the time, none of us knew how to make an electronic anything, so we were just blagging it. But we had basically 9 months to build this thing. So first step was this video's got no sound, don't worry. So we just wanted the thing to look like a Victorian instrument, but have this kind of uncanny online side to it. So we went out to this place out on the outskirts of Edinburgh. It was heavenly. It was just this room's full of weird old technology and junk that we were able to pick up quite cheaply, and we basically decided to take all of this stuff and turn it into somehow a musical instrument. So that here you can see some wax cylinder recordings, a weird gas mask. There was actually a child skeleton in a jar, which was a wee bit disturbing in this room. But yeah, so we gathered a lot of this stuff, and then the plan was to build something that looked like this. And that's actually what it did end up looking like. So this is basically a converted old Victorian wardrobe full of these junk shop instruments that we retrofitted with robotic beaters that would then play the music. And and the horns at the top we used to actually play some vocals. And the vocals were recorded onto, we got a dub plate, which is a kind of vinyl record with the vocals on it. And then a record player that would like put needle down at the right time, so the vocals would come out of these gramophone horns along with the music. And we were given this porter cabin out on the outskirts of Edinburgh to build Cyberphone in. I'll show you in a minute a little video, an amusing video of how inept we were at building it. But in the end, it did turn out like this, so it worked. We managed to build it. It was an amusing moment where we finished building it, and it was 2 days before it had to be installed in the gallery, and we realized we'd made it. We'd built it in parts in the porter cabin, and only when it came to move it did we realize that there was no way we could get it out of the door, because we'd actually made it too big. So there was a point where we were wondering about taking the roof off the porter cabin, but instead we just had to dismantle it all and move it in parts. But I'm just kind of emphasizing that we really didn't know what we were doing, and it still worked out okay. This is what it looks like inside. So this is an Indian classical instrument called the Shruti box, which is meant for doing drones for meditation. And instead we retrofitted it so we could actually play quite fast musical pieces on it, or rather Cyberphone could. We'll show you in a minute a little video about how that was made. That's the records that had some vocals on it. So we actually got the Scottish vocalist Aidan Moffat from Arab Strap to record the vocals, and we collaborate more with him in a later project I'll talk to you about. This was the centerpiece to Cyberphone. So this is an old school voltmeter, which we controlled, and this is what showed the emotional state of the robot, everything from desolation to delirium. And this would change over the course of time as it checked its stats. And you see at the bottom there, very small, so people who peer at it and looked closely enough could see powered by Facebook, Flickr, Google, MySpace, Twitter, Vimeo, and so on. So we wanted it to be there, but just not super apparent, and so only people who really kind of started thinking about it could see what was going on with Cyberphone. That's just some of the code inside Cyberphone's brain, which was in one of its drawers. And what we did was we pre-composed loads and loads and loads of music for it, and then rated the pieces of music by the emotional valence, whether we thought it was cheerful or not cheerful. And so essentially what Cyberphone was doing was selecting from its tracks based on its emotional state. Right, here's a little video. Hope the sound will work of what Cyberphone sounded like. It's not a very good recording. As the years went by, we got better at documenting our projects, as you'll see. So that's what Cyberphone sounded like. Right at the last minute, as we were installing it in the gallery, I added a feature which I didn't really think much about, and that was I decided to give Cyberphone a voice online. So basically, whenever Cyberphone changed its emotional state, it tweeted out, "I am feeling," and then just the word. And what really struck me about this project was how important that turned out to be. So all it's saying is, "I am feeling desolation," or "I am feeling blah," right? And it's so obviously not human, right? It was the dumbest user interface possible, and yet something about that made people complicit in a game of anthropomorphizing this wardrobe. And so we started to get all these responses from people. So people would respond, like trying to cheer Cyberphone up, play our song Sweetie. There were some people who were a bit creepy. They kept going back to the gallery twice a day to meet Cyberphone and sit with Cyberphone for a while. It was a bit peculiar. Like other people with advice on how to cheer up, thanking Cyberphone for playing a tune. Cheer up, you're the moodiest musical cupboard I've ever seen. And the irony is that every time someone did this, it did cheer Cyberphone up because Cyberphone was getting more hits. But the way I designed it to be addictive. So if the next day it didn't get as many, it would fall into despair. So there was this kind of awful codependency that we'd created. Let me see. So really fun things like people sending virtual gifts. So this is a furniture polish gift to Cyberphone. Why so quiet today? Cyberphone, did someone unplug your Ethernet cable? Turns out that is actually what happened. And the funny thing is that it was offline for 2 days, and when it got plugged back in, it had such a spike in traffic that it went into delirium and would have been in depression for the entire rest of its existence if I hadn't gone through and sort of edited its memory so it didn't see that spike. Cyberphone, are you watching the Scotland game too? So clearly from a football fan there. So that was what we did for that gallery exhibition, and what surprised us was really what happened next. So Wired magazine covered it. Robot Band plays music, obsesses about online followers. Various newspapers around the world started covering stupid musical cupboard. So something about this really captured 2009, captured people's insecurities and fears, I think, about social media at the time, and they saw themselves in this funny Victorian cupboard. And eventually, the next year, Cyberphone actually won a BAFTA. So BAFTA is the UK equivalent of the Oscars. So I actually had to go and collect this BAFTA statue for Cyberphone on behalf of Cyberphone at an award ceremony. Frankly, it's totally absurd. And then to top it all, the National Museum of Scotland decided to collect Cyberphone as their representation of social media at the turn of the century. So Cyberphone now belongs to Scotland, and for a while it had a place in the National Museum. There it is, looking very pleased with itself. And now it's no longer ours. I don't have to look after it anymore. It's collected in a museum. It's actually in the stores out in Edinburgh now. And that was a very peculiar experience to have been part of, but it did open a lot of doors for us for various other projects. So the second one I'm going to talk about. Actually, before I do, and I don't really have time. I was going to show you a film of the making of. I'll show you at the end if there's time, but for the time I'll just skip that and go on to the next project. So this is a project called End of Forgetting. And this is one of my favorites, but it's not one of our more well-known ones. And this came about because I'd read this New York Times article in 2010 called "The Web Means the End of Forgetting," which I've really affected me, actually, and I thought a really fascinating way of looking at the world. And in the quote from the paper, it says, how should we live our lives in a world where the internet records everything and forgets nothing, where every online photo, status update, Twitter post, and blog entry by and about us can be stored forever? And I think that's a really profound shift in human culture, is this idea that this promiscuous sharing has turned into promiscuous storage. And so you can't delete something. You might think you can, but you probably can't, because it's copied on like this, it has this magnetic trace over all of these devices across the internet. And I don't think people think enough about what this means. I mean, you get examples of where people are denied entry into countries because of something they posted, or they lose a job or whatever. But I think it's more than that. It's something about the importance of forgetting for how we conceive the world. So we wanted to make an object for a gallery that somehow got people to think about this. And this is the object we made. So this is like, it just sits there plugged into the mains, no obvious speakers or anything, but it makes sound. And what it does is it's continually listening. It's got a microphone hidden in it, and it picks up any conversations in the gallery, anyone walking by, it picks it up and records it, and it's got a big hard disk. And then it has this wheel on the top. And if people touch the wheel and move the wheel, it actually scans back in time and plays audio from arbitrary points back in time. The faster you turn it, the further back in time. So what people typically did would be to say, oh, what's this? And then they'd touch the wheel and they'd hear themselves saying, oh, what's this? And they'd turn it back further and they'd hear other people who weren't in the gallery, and further still, more people. And it was at that point people started to go really quiet, because they realized that what they'd just said was there somewhere, and someone turning the wheel might hear it. And there was no delete button. And the other thing that End of Forgetting does is every few minutes it would go on to a popular audio diary website, where the diaries, people place their audio diaries freely available, and it would just choose a random 2-second snippet of someone's audio diary and just play it out in the gallery, and that got added to the memories. So this is just a little very short video about End of Forgetting, and what you're hearing is the sound End of Forgetting is making.
One teaspoon. Corredor de Linares, el sur metropolitano.
I had a quick look on Google Maps. It's actually remembered. Yeah, it's remembered everything since it was initially produced. I didn't like just like disturbance. I didn't like.
Times, caput, contrast, the holiness.
De médico. Bien.
As in fact, the ciencias I see is between. Now he is. Shame on you, and they were pointing at the police officer, and a protester was arrested and was just put in the van. Depending on where you are, good afternoon or good evening.
So that was End of Forgetting. And yeah, there's some funny things about its making. So when you turned the wheel far enough back, you actually got some of the audio recording of us in our workshop while we were making it. And after we installed it, there were irritations that we'd had with the gallery on one of the days, or one of the people involved in the gallery, and we'd been talking about it, and I realized that we'd been talking about it next to End of Forgetting. And I realized that there was a chance that the people working in the gallery would hear us talking about them behind their back, and we were sort of caught by our own device in that way, which I thought was quite a fun lesson. Okay, so that was a kind of a transitional piece for us. The next one I'm going to talk about again relates to memory and the importance of memory and what memory does. And this is a piece called Unravel. And this was related quite a bit to Cyberphon because there was a pressure on us in a way to do more of that kind of musical band type of installations. And this one we had a lot of funding for, so we were able to actually make a complete band of robotic players. So this is what it looked like. So we had chimes, a full drum kit, a keyboard, and the crucial thing for Unravel was this record player that sits in the middle there. And what people would do is they'd come and take one of these 7-inch records out of the record player, out of the record box, and put it on the record player and start the record. And instead of hearing the record, they would hear this whole band play. But what it would play would differ. You could play the same record again, and it would do something slightly different. And I'll just give you a little snippet of a piece of music that it produced, and I'll explain what that's got to do with memory.
In the morning, she whispered as we tiptoed up the stairs and past my parents' bedroom. I thought of all those nights spent in headphones, listening to love songs and dreaming serenades, all that diary doggerel and homework doodling, the secret late phone calls and comfort and cuddles, and the 100 reasons why you should never sleep with your friends. But here she was, the coolest girl in school, squeezing my hand and giggling with fear. And all it took was some strawberry wine.
So the way this installation worked is we had this box of records, and that singer was Aidan Moffat from Arab Strap. And what we asked him to do was come up with a set of his favourite 7-inch singles that meant something to him as a writer from his childhood and his youth. And he gave us these 7-inch singles, and what we did was we pressed a bunch of records that actually had a control signal on them, and then stuck the replicas of the labels. So they looked like the original 7-inch singles, but they were actually controlling the computer inside Unravel. And then we asked Aidan to write a piece of music that was related to each of these tracks, each of these records. But we asked him to write hundreds of different versions of it. This was a mammoth writing task. And the idea was that when you played Unravel, the particular version of the song, which usually they were all confessionals, the particular version you got depended on various factors. And the crucial factors were the time of day. So later on, the versions got much more rude. The audience, which was just basically how many people were in the gallery. So the idea was that a narrator would speak differently to a small audience, an intimate audience, than to a large one. Opinion, which was we were doing sentiment analysis on tweets about Unravel, and again, the same kind of idea is that like if Unravel was feeling popular, then it would become confident rather than insecure, and the types of stories would change. So, for example, in the story where he might be recounting a time where he tried to pick up a girl at a disco, if he was feeling confident, the story would end up going well for him, and if he was feeling insecure, he might remember the story differently. And then pressure was just the weather. So, whether it was raining outside or sunny outside, again, changing the variant of the memory. So the idea was that you would get this sense that there's something like really locked into these vinyl records, a groove that feels immutable. And yet what you're getting is a story that you're not quite sure what's the definitive version of this. And the notion is that there isn't a definitive version. Like all our memories are shaped by the current circumstance and how that affects how we saw things in the past. Again, this project went a bit mad. So we ended up performing it live in the Queen's Hall in Edinburgh. And to do this, we put Unravel up on live, and we had a massive version of the opinion, the Twitter analysis showing on the screen. And then we invited the audience, and it was like a few hundred people, to tweet at Unravel, and that would change the music that played. And it ended up being this hilarious like barrage of heckling from the audience. I don't know how many of you will know what fanny means in Scots, but someone had worked out how to put an arrow in a tweet so that it pointed at one of us, Tommy, there when it appeared on the screen. And all of this would change the opinion dial, and that would change what Unravel did and what Aidan and the other musicians who were playing along did. So that was really good fun. And then even more weirdly, out of that, the whiskey maker Dewar's got in touch and decided they wanted to produce a short-run single cask malt whiskey based on the installation, and that was the Unravel single cask whiskey, which ended up actually being very well reviewed, and it's now a collector's item. And that led, like, very quickly, the last couple I'll go through quite fast. So that led to a collaboration with Dewar's called Tasting Notes. And the idea here was to create a device that Dewar's could take when they were doing whiskey tasting. And one of the things I was kind of interested in was thinking about the language that's used for describing whiskies. And so when you came up to Unravel, you would taste a whiskey, and then you would dial in what you smelled on the nose of the whiskey and what it tasted like, but you would also put in a single word into these wheels in the center of Tasting Notes, and that would be a memory, a word that's associated with that taste. So the idea is to sort of make you think about memory. And then what Tasting Notes did is it did a kind of analysis based on the frequency of the letters in the word to come up with a brightness based on some research on synesthesia and words. And that would give people a little receipt, which would have a unique piece of music that was associated with their tasting experience. Right, the last one I want to talk to you about is the most recent and is still ongoing. And this is a project called Sing the Gloaming. And this is the one project where I think the relationship between the art and my scientific research is the closest. And this is a project around a bunch of words that begin with GL. So if you think of a word in English starting with GL, you might think glass, you might think glow, gleam, gloom, glitter. And if you look at all of these words, you notice that they all share something in common, right? They all seem to be something to do with light or vision in some way. And it turns out there's lots and lots of these things that crop up in languages, and they're called phonosthemes, where there's this connection between the sound of a word. And it relates to what we were talking about earlier about naturalness and iconicity. There's a relationship between the sound of the word and its meaning, but it's not one of compositionality. And the reason these occur is because of history, right? So in Proto-Indo-European, there was a root, chlay, which meant something like to shine or glow or be warm. And then the Proto-Indo-European languages took that root word and borrowed it, well, not borrowed it, but it persisted in these languages. And the sound changed and the meanings changed until you ended up with this huge set of words that were then borrowed across the ancestor languages, until you end up with a situation where you have a whole load of words that all share the same root but have come through different paths through history. And that's why you get this correspondence between sound and meaning. And so what we wanted to do was create a piece of music, and it existed initially as an installation in a forest during the night. So people would go to this forest and walk around this installation, and each of these boxes would sing one of these GL words, and the boxes were arranged to match that historical relatedness of the words. And that ended up as a record that is now available on vinyl from Blackfoot Hill Records. And I've got a little documentary film about that. It's about 3 or 4 minutes long, and I'll play that to finish this talk, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions, if that's okay.
Sing the Gloaming is a project on light, language and landscape, created using experimental art and music and featuring some of Scotland's finest vocalists. The project is a collaboration between Professor Simon Kirby, the artist and musician Tommy Perman, and me, Rob St John. We're taking our inspiration from Simon's research into language evolution to create a 10-inch record in bespoke packaging designed by Tommy. The record moves between ambient washes of vocals, rich harmonies, and abstract modular synth pulses and drones. It was created after we contacted 7 friends with invitations to collaborate. We asked them to find a place where light moves, then improvise short new vocal pieces around particular light words there.
The light words in Sing the Gloaming are phonosthemes. Phonosthemes are words whose form seems to evoke their meaning directly. In the English language, there are many phonous themes beginning with GL, which relate to light. For example, glimmer, glitter, glow. Gleam, and gloom. These words have all evolved from a single word, spoken over 5,000 years ago near the Black Sea. Their different forms and meanings bear the hallmarks of their individual roots through history, across languages and cultures to present-day English. Singers were asked to think about the qualities of the space they were in, and those of the words themselves when they recorded their pieces. Once each singer had finished their recordings, they were passed on to the next singer, who in turn listened and improvised their own light word piece. Melodies emerged and evolved in this process, mirroring the real-world evolution of the words themselves.
The singers' recordings were recomposed using a series of innovative production techniques. Using modular synthesizers, granular synthesis, and convolution reverbs, created directly from data on the use of the gl words in 5 million books published since 1500.
Glint, 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 glint.
But for all this conceptual thinking and tinkering, we've aimed to create a record that is playful and joyous to listen to. The vocals wash in and out, creating new clusters of chords, melodies, and rhythms. Each singer collaborating with the next. Their collective efforts coalescing, like the words in language itself. Tiny fleeting sounds from their recordings are extracted and reshaped as fluttering percussion and guttural sub-bass. Imagine experimental musicians let loose in a language science lab.
Okay, and thanks for your time and patience, and thanks to my collaborators on the arts side, who are all much more beardy than my collaborators on the science side.
Thank you very much. Applause. We got 3 minutes left.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I don't know if everybody else feels the same, but like the combination of these two aspects of life, that's why I feel I'm here on the planet. That's like what makes me happy. Thank you very much. And so, I don't know, Mark Hannett has a question.
Sorry, I don't know. I have blocked the video. I cannot put.
I can hear you though. That's
yeah.
Good.
Very nice presentation. I really like it. I mean, the second part, I mean, I am an artist and I really love your projects. I saw your website because Andres told me, but yeah, I mean, I don't have a particular question apart of like, maybe like you said in the last, that this last project is the one that has more influence on your both research in academia and the artistic side. I'm trying to combine both. I'm doing latent space navigation in my PhD studies, and that's my artistic practice going. But yeah, maybe another day we can chat. I mean, I really like the projects and the approach of fun also and enjoyment, and also conceptually, I think are quite strong.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, on that, one thing a few things I can, like, if I can be pass down wisdom, I suppose, to the extent I have wisdom about these things. For me, art-science collaboration takes time, right? So that singular gloaming was the one where they really start to intermesh, but that's like 10 to 15 years on of working with some of these same people. So I think patience and time, rather than trying to force things together, and then you just allow these things to naturally grow together. That would be my advice. And the other thing is like I've said, my mission statement is to do art and science and not know the difference. And I'm not there yet. That was still 2 talks, but my goal is definitely to not know the difference. So to that end, I've started to put artists on all of my research grant applications, and so far it's been successful. And I would encourage it to be the default to involve artists in your research. And what that means to me is that have artists, help with experiment design and try not to have like an us and them approach to it, and just say that we, these artists and scientists are both interested in the same question. So it's something I've learned absolutely clearly. Like, we are not asking different questions. We just have different backgrounds, different sets of expertise. So if you can combine those, that's the best way forward, right? There's so many synergies to be had between different kinds of people who are both interested in the same questions. So for me, like the question of what it means to be human, that's absolutely an arts question that scientists have just started to stumble into. And it makes sense to me to involve artists at every stage in my research practice as a result. So I'm glad to hear that that's your aim too.
Yeah, we have the artists on board. Yes, exactly. So we're still figuring out the collaboration points, I guess. So yeah, exactly. And so I think that is we sort of officially ran out of time, but I think we should make that comment. So in CUDAN, we have artists and we have scientists. And the interesting thing, I think, is, and that is important, like everybody needs to survive. And, it's a safe bet to go on linguistics papers and get your tenure with that. The same would be true with art history monographs. I did make that mistake. So when the review committees asked, it was like, oh, no, we don't count that stuff over there because it's just animation. We don't count that stuff over there because it's too natural science, and this is too humanities for the natural sciences and stuff like that. So you can get into these kind of like discussion things. But the neat thing here at CUDAN is like Mar, for example, is really established artist. The same is true for Tilman. He's already established as an artist, and now you do more sciencey stuff, where again, scientists will see it as science and artists may see it as art. I think what's on our side is history will prove us right. That's also true if you look at the people who did the same stuff, in the 1970s in Oakland. Now we look up to them, they had the same issues, but the same was true for physicists. Like Max Planck complained all of his life that he took like 50 years to get like his stuff in physics in the door. And he famously said, science advances one funeral at a time. And so in a sense, if we're all there for us together and we can actually sort of like, on the one hand, it's a lot of work, as you say, to actually sort of negotiate and mutually understand each other. That's also true in the sciences, so to speak, between natural science and humanities, but also with art versus science, computer science versus, say, more quantitative stuff. That is our work. But in the end, we should get to a point where we can communicate the product. And ideally, it's products where, there is not just speaking to scientists, not just speaking to artists. And I think your work is like super interesting in that realm, and I think that kind of it's a little bit a design flaw of our world, right? That you have to sort of always go for either it's a scientific paper or it's an artwork, but while all the conversation typically happens with people who do like both, sort of, right? So that's like an interesting thing.
I mean, what are on the recognition side? One of the things that has been a real surprise to me in the UK, at least. So we have this, I think this is also happening in other countries, this emphasis on impact, right? Research impact. And the idea is non-academic users of your research. And in the UK, we have this REF, this Research Excellence Framework, which is a thing that happens every 6 years and sets the funding for the university for the following 6. And 25% of that funding is based on these impact case studies. And you only have a handful per department. And both of the last REFs, the stuff I've described today, went as an impact case study. So Cyberphone went as an impact case study. And this year, signal gloaming and other things have gone on in as an impact case study. And both times it looks like the first time it was the highest possible rating. So it turns out that's worth nearly £1 million to the university to have a high impact case study. Now the thing is, like, I was like, is this really impact? And it turns out that from the government's point of view, it's impact, amusingly, not because of its impact on people who go to a gallery or whatever, but for them it was the impact on the artist's practice. So the fact I was collaborating with artists and they were able to write and say, this has changed the way I think about certain things, that was considered impact. So there are roots, and I think in a funny way, this kind of thing might become more rather than less valued outside of the gatekeeping world of science. And I think actually this is one of the cases where us as academics are more of the problem than the funders are. In fact, we're trained gatekeepers, academics are. And I would really like to see that change. I would like us all to be, I mean, I'm not talking to you specifically, but I would like us all to be a lot less skeptical of outsider perspectives, because, like, sure as hell, everything in our upbringing is about closing doors and gatekeeping and keeping people out. If you actually analyze what peer review does and what grant proposal reviewing does by peers, that's ultimately what's driving it, and I think that's very problematic.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. I want to close it with 2 words. Yes, and.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry I went so long.
Bye-bye.
Bye.